Welcome to WiredToHunt's Whitetail How-Tos, where we provide a step-by-step tutorial for one important deer hunting task. I want to talk about hunting large open food sources and the mistakes that a lot of people make when doing that. The thing about open large food sources is that they're very tempting to hunt because you can see a large ways, and as hunters we want to see critters, right? We want to go out there so we can see stuff. Problem is that seeing deer and killing deer are two very different things. I think we should first explore what the mistakes are that people make when they actually try to do this, and then we can explore how to maybe pull it off in a way that will actually work. Imagine if you wanted to hunt this big cut bean field. Deer are gonna come out and feed on these beans in December. That should be great, right? And you sit there and you hunt, and maybe you do see a bunch of deer, but the hunt gets done. You wanna get back to your truck. If you don't have a really good plan for how to get out of there, you're gonna be in trouble when you have to walk across that big wide open field and scare those deer, or even just getting out of your tree stand on the edge of that bean field. And on the flip side, if you wanted to hunt an open area in the morning, getting into that kind of area without spooking deer is very difficult because these large food sources hold deer for a long period of time in the evening and the morning. So these aren't pass-through locations usually, right? This is the destination. So when you're hunting on the destination, you really need to be thinking carefully about how you're gonna get there or get out of there. So that's rule number one. If you can't do that, you're educating those deer and they're not gonna come out during daylight. Number two, it can be really difficult to pinpoint where the deer will actually be coming in or out or feeding around there. Especially if you're bow hunting, you really need to have 20, 30, 40 yard window of opportunity. You need to know how to get close to those deer. And when you're hunting a 100-acre field, it's hard to do that, as opposed to hunting a little tiny bedding area on a ridge. It's a lot easier to pick the spot to bow hunt on that zone versus having 100 acres or 30 acres of wide open food and trying to figure that out. And the third thing is just the fact that many bucks, mature bucks especially, simply won't want to expose themselves out in this. These deer are crafty. They've made it to 3 years old or 4 years old or 5 years old for a reason. And the reason is that they avoided hot spots of human activity. The edge of a big wide open food source is often a human hotspot. We like sitting these things and seeing a bunch of deer. Well, bucks pick up on that too. So when you try to sit at the edge of a big wide open food source and you're thinking, I'm gonna see a bunch of deer, you very well might, but that big 4 or 5 year old buck you've been dreaming about, he probably isn't the deer that's gonna step out in daylight there. If you're gonna hunt a large food source, there are some things you can do to up your odds, especially if you're in a low pressure area. Let's address all of those different mistakes I mentioned. Getting in and out of a food source, how do you do that on a large food source without ruining your future hunts by spooking deer? Well, a couple things to consider. One thing is try to make sure that you are accessing through the back door, because you gotta think about where are the deer right now when you're coming in or out. So if you think the deer are feeding out in the field, try to have some kind of setup back off of the food source in the cover a little ways and try to find a way to access from that side. So you can get in walking through the timber where the deer are not, and then catching them leaving the food source later in the day. Now here's the flip side. For an evening hunt, the deer are going from the timber or the cover to the food source, right? So now you need to know, how do I get out of here while they're on the food source? Maybe you can find a way to walk through the timber out the back door while they're all out feeding and slip out with them seeing you. If you don't have an option like that, something I've used a lot and got away with it is have a friend or a family member drive in with a vehicle, a UTV, an ATV, something like that to spook the deer off the big field so then you can get out. You don't want to do that all the time if you don't have to, but if you don't have any other better option, it certainly helps. So that's one way to deal with the access issue with large open fields. Another thing I mentioned was the trickiness of picking where to hunt on a large food source. Well, there's a couple things you can do there. Number one, there are certain types of features that bucks especially, but deer in general, tend to prefer when coming in and out of a large food source. One thing is low spots. If there's a big wide open field, but there happens to be one low area in it, 9 times out of 10, that's probably gonna be the spot that a buck's gonna wanna step out in and feed in because he feels a little bit more safe. He's a little bit more secluded, a little bit more out of view of other things. Not to mention there's some scent dropping down in there with thermals if there's a lot of hills and stuff like that. So low spots tend to be an area where deer will come in and out, or maybe that will be where they cross. Speaking of crossings, if you can find anywhere where this large open food source pinches down, almost like a hourglass type situation, that can be an area where if bucks have to cross from one patch of cover to another, that will be the area where that will most commonly happen. So that's another way to kind of find a funnel or some type of concentrating feature within a large food source. Another thing is inside corners. Anywhere where you have this natural juncture of two different lines of cover coming together, deer will often use that as a safe entry point to fields, and they'll feel just a little bit more secluded feeding in that corner versus coming out on some random flat side of the field. Of course, there's going to be lots of other unique features that might influence why deer might want to use an open field or how they would get into it. And so that's where some kind of observation is going to pay off. If you are new to an area, sit up high, sit away from the meat of the activity for a couple times and watch what these deer are actually doing. 3 observation sits that lead to 1 good educated sit is a lot better than 4 willy-nilly hunts all over the place where you might spook deer and not know a thing about what they're actually doing. The last thing I'll mention, we talked about how in many areas bucks don't want to step foot in a large open food source. If you hunt Iowa, heavily managed farm, you've got 1,000 acres, maybe they will. But let's say you're hunting in Michigan and there's 30 guys all over the place and these bucks don't want to do that. Well, in that situation, just don't sit on the edge of the food source. Get into the timber a little bit, find where they're transitioning to the open food source, hunt them there. I've had this situation many times in the places that I hunt in Michigan where you'll see lots of deer in the big open cornfield, but the big buck, he's always 30, 40, 50 yards back in the timber. Find a way to get into there, catch the deer as they move along, as they check it, or as they're passing through, and you'll have a lot more luck if that's the kind of deer you're going after. Be mindful of those challenges with hunting open food sources, and if you choose to do so still, make sure you adjust properly. If you want more information like this, be sure to tune into the WiredToHunt podcast or the WiredToHunt Foundation's mini-series. We've got new deer hunting know-how every week. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts.